Thanks everyone for being here with us. As Haley said, I'm Carrie Staten. I'm the director of Mid-Atlantic Tab. Before we get started, I would invite everyone to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, what brings you here today. We have a small group, so I do think we can unmute later when we get into our question portion. And I will say that for me, I'm happy to answer questions at any time. But I can't see both screens at the same time. So if you right now will just raise your hand if you have a question, and then Haley will help me call on folks. But we will get started. I'll give you a second to type in the chat. This is sort of the second part of a series in community engagement that we have been running over the summer and now into the fall. You don't have to have been at the first session for this session to be meaningful to you. And so I wanted to just recap a little bit what we talked about in our last session. I think that's my next slide, Haley. So what is community engagement? We've all been to an incredibly boring public meeting in our lives, probably more than I'd like to admit, frankly. And when you're talking about something as sort of technical as brownfield redevelopment, it can on its surface appear boring and maybe not attract a lot of people because a flyer that says come talk about dirty old factories maybe isn't very attractive to folks. But what we have been talking about in this series and what we're going to talk a little bit more about today is how to make it more exciting, how to make sure that you're really engaging people in a meaningful way. But to do that, we first have to understand exactly what community engagement is. Next slide. So at its core, community engagement is broad citizen engagement to share information, to get feedback and input and buy-in from the broader community on anything really, but in our case, we're talking about brownfield redevelopment, whether that's a specific site that you're already working on a plan and a remediation on, or maybe you're just getting started and you're doing more like inventory and assessment work. But that is our context. It is a way to get input and share information, a way to work together with your community and with your stakeholders. And it might be required. So a lot of times for a grant, especially if you're thinking about a cleanup grant or a multi-purpose grant, as we all sit on with bated breath waiting for the EPA guidelines to come out any second now, there are requirements, but the requirements don't mean that it has to be boring. Just because you have to have a meeting doesn't mean you have to have a boring meeting. No one requires a boring meeting. So at its very best, community engagement is inclusive, it's genuine, it's collaborative, it's creative and fun. Next slide. So I think this hands me over to Kendra. So before I hand it over, we have a great panel of speakers today. We have Kendra Hatcher with Downstream Strategies, which is an environmental firm. We have Taylor Bennett with the Land Stewardship Corporation in West Virginia, and we have Heather Hudson with Unleashed Tiger. And the reason we invited them to join us today is because they have all worked on a lot of brownfield projects. They've done a lot of community engagement and they've done really creative community engagement. And so they're going to chat with us about their experiences and some specific examples in a small town in West Virginia where they were able to meet the basic requirements of EPA, but not be boring. So Kendra, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Carrie. As Carrie mentioned, oftentimes it is a requirement. Once you hopefully get your grant and you're going through the process, whether it's a cleanup or even assessment, there's usually inclusion of community outreach in some capacity. That is really important. If you said in your grant and that you were going to do community engagement and said you were going to have so many meetings or whatever type of engagement you had, it is really important that you make sure and you carry through with those specific activities. And that you document those activities and that you're keeping track of doing those type of things. So that is sort of the boring part that you do have to take care of, and it is really important. But this is a really good opportunity as someone who's been a consultant for a number of brownfield projects. The community engagement, it can be a really good opportunity to learn things that you otherwise, that information is hard to get out of. We can pull all the data, we can look at records, We can visit sites, but so really, to me, understanding the stories in those communities, understanding stories about particular properties is one really interesting. I mean, it's part of the reason that I do what I do, but it really gives depth to what you're doing. So I think it's really important for that engagement. The other thing is really getting that community buy-in and connection. You know, for these projects to be successful, the most successful brownfield projects I have seen have a lot of community input, a lot of community engagement, that folks in the community want to know what's going on. They want to participate. You know, you're basically inviting, it's a way to invite the community in and to solve a problem. You know, these communities, we're going to talk a lot about Grafton, West Virginia today. And in Grafton, you know, people walk down their streets and they see that there's a lot of buildings that aren't being utilized, maybe the best they can. And you know, there's a lot of people who see these as issues. You know, you can bring them into this brownfields process to, you know, invite them in, understand, you know, information that they have, but really gets them into helping solve that problem. The other part is, you know, having a meeting or having some sort of event early in the process. You understand what people are thinking. You know, are people angry about this? Are people, you know, what are community concerns? Are they concerned about safety? You know, so you can really get that insight. You know, what are people looking for if they're getting involved in this type of project? What are their priorities? It's also a great way to get the inside scoop, is the way that I put it. But you know, having events where you get to talk to people either one-on-one or in a big group, you can get a lot of interesting information. Again, that's harder to get if you know if you're not going out and speaking to the people in the community. One example might be, you know, having a conversation with someone and in passing, oh, so-and-so's uncle is interested in buying this property, or, you know, my brother's has this idea and wants to find a space to have this type of business, you know. So that's really interesting and important to start to get a sense of what's happening in the community. Another great example are you know, maybe folks that have lived in the community for a long time, and you know, we mentioned these old factories. There's people in the communities that worked in those factories, or potentially their parents worked in those factories. So, you know, sometimes you can get information about properties based on, you know, just community history. And that's really important. Again, there could be good tidbits of information, but just understanding that community story is really interesting and important as well. I think the other thing that can be really important when we're doing some sort of outreach is, you know, addressing rumors or community hearsay straight on. A lot of times when we're talking about brownfields, we're talking about properties that look really ugly, you know, decrepit buildings, or, you know, giant factory, you know, properties that are just sitting there. There's a perception in communities a lot of times that these properties can't be redeveloped. They're eyesores, they're dangerous. And so having some sort of outreach or community event, say later in your process, where you've started to do assessments, where you've started to do research and understand some of these properties, you know, it's a great opportunity to sort of say to folks, look, you know, we understand there have been rumors for a long time, or people have these perceptions, but we can say this is not the case. You know, yes, this building, this structure doesn't look very pretty, but you know, there's actually nothing that dangerous about it. So what can we do? What are steps that we need to take to redevelop it, to move it to the next step? You know, or in some cases, just the opposite. For instance, there might be some building that someone's really interested or wanting to invest in, but, you know, understanding the potential liabilities they might have. Could be a lot of asbestos, lead-based paint, that sort of thing. So some things that could make redevelopment difficult. So just really being able to get out there and get in the community and get additional information is beneficial, and bring that community into your project. Next slide, please. So what are ways to engage your community? And I think the best answer that I have for that is any and every way that is possibly feasible. And that's just, obviously, we're all different people. We all want to engage in things in different ways. A lot of people, most people probably don't want to go sit at a boring public meeting and get preached to, but there's some people who are, you know, sort of interested. They can sit back quietly, sort of take in information. Maybe they don't necessarily want to actively engage, but it still might be something they want to gather. So those are opportunities that you can, you know, provide if that's all that was possible. But there are very simple ways that you can potentially make those opportunities a little more interesting. And we'll get into those specifics in a couple of slides. But again, the point is, community engagement isn't sort of a one and done sort of thing. Often, there's an expectation or requirement that you have multiple community engagement opportunities. So that could mean some sort of a public meeting. It could mean community events, whether you're creating a community event or you're sort of tagging onto events that are already happening in a community. Again, we'll provide some examples of those here in a couple slides. Another sort of typical way that folks have reached out to communities are presentations to city council or county commission. And then you have other opportunities of getting to speaking to people one-on-one, setting up meetings. Maybe you have some sort of a public engagement and start to have a conversation with someone. Well, that might be an opportunity to bring them in further, set up on one-on-one meetings or get more information about different community members and setting up stakeholder meetings. So, maybe one opportunity might lead to another, The other way to think about public engagement as well is all those things of getting your face out there and communicating are really great. But this is an ongoing, these projects are long, they're usually a couple of years. There's a lot of stuff that you might want to convey. So having a website or social media, setting things up that you can be, relatively frequently updating the community and providing communication about what's going on in the project, or there's a particular building that's very interesting to folks, providing updates as much as you possibly can. Surveys are another way that people have often gathered information. That could be potentially in person, writing out sort of a list of questions, or now there are a lot of free, relatively easy to set up opportunities online. Even Google has a survey that it's really easy for most people to be able to create a survey and share that widely. So although those aren't those are not maybe you standing up and talking, those can be important tools for sharing information. And again, just keeping your community engaged and informed throughout your process. And I think just one other thing about, as any way that is feasible, there has to be, these things have to be achievable. As you can go as big and as interesting as you want, and that's really great as long as somebody's the cheerleader, somebody can carry those activities out. But you can still have an interesting, intimate experience with folks if it has to be on a smaller scale. As you're working in, these communities best. So also thinking about how you can tailor that sort of outreach to your community. And reaching people where they are is really important. So next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit, because that's my job, is to be a consultant for Brownfield projects. Just sort of mentioning a few ways that, you can bring your consultant in and, help you with public engagement, or, lead public engagement, whatever makes the most sense for you. This is something that we often do. So and in many cases we have materials, or we sort of have tricks and things that we could bring along that can be helpful. There's no need to necessarily start everything from scratch, because people have been doing public engagement for a while. You can also, sort of use your consultant as good cop, bad cop, for example. You can use someone, maybe there's not great information to share. Sometimes it's easier or for someone else to share that information. Hey, this building, we were really hoping would sort of be a cornerstone project. We're really hoping we were going to be able to do something with it, but there is so much work to be done, or there's some really significant environmental concerns here, and there's just not really anything that we can do. Hearing that from somebody else, or someone who's sort of considered an expert, might make things a little easier to take in. The other thing, just having a consultant support, is you might be able to go bigger. I sort of mentioned the last slide, doing things that are feasible for you. Having additional help really could potentially help you push to that next level. If you're not worried about creating all the slides or creating materials or that sort of thing, you can focus on the fun part. You can focus on, type of activities that you want to include, games, or, things other ways that would engage the public. And you can kind of leave the boring stuff to your consultant. They can be the ones bringing the maps and that sort of stuff. You can also use them to make sure, again, sort of back to that very first slide where we're talking about, making sure you're meeting your requirements, because it's important, you can make sure they can take care of that sort of stuff. And again, you can sort of focus on your community and getting the information that you're interested in. Next slide. So as Carrie mentioned, and I mentioned, I've worked on a number of different projects. We, Downstream Strategies, worked with the Brownfields Assistance Center on their assessment grant with a focus on Grafton and Taylor County. And just going to go through a couple of things that we did during that process. Very early on, when we first started the assessment grant, we had what we held what we called the GIG, the Grafton Information Gathering. And this was an event, it was meant to be fairly casual and drop in. We were there for a number, I forget exactly, but 3 hours or something like that. People could come and go sort of towards the end of the day, so we could gather people maybe before picking up kids from school into after work, that type of thing. The photo that's on the bottom right is a photo from that from our GIG event. This was held in Grafton at a coffee shop. Mention that being a key component of this is, encouraging people to come there. It really helps if you have food, if you have drink, and having a safe, comfortable place for folks to go to. Grafton had a lovely little coffee shop that had plenty of space. They welcomed people in, so it made it a great opportunity for folks to come in and relax. And they weren't stressed. They could, sit down, have something to eat, have something to drink. They had tables, larger tables that had chairs all around, as you can see here. So it was nice that people could sit down, they could look each other in the eye and had an opportunity to really talk. We brought a number of maps. So this was a fairly intimate experience where, we got to talk to people one-on-one. We left maps for people. They could leave notes for us. We brought boards where people could make notes and things to hang up. So some people didn't necessarily want to talk or share particular information with us or feedback. They could add a note on the slide that would be, we wouldn't necessarily know who it was. So that was a good event. I think total, about 30 some people came all throughout which is, pretty good for a public meeting. And we got a lot of really good public input, a lot of good feedback from that, and made other connections, which is nice, kind of connecting with folks in the community, understanding who was doing what, and that would follow up with those folks later to get additional info. Another thing we mentioned, sometimes you don't necessarily have to create your own event, but can sort of tag along onto an event that's already happening. So Grafton had First Friday events. And the one that we attended was, I think, really fun for us. It was a Harry Potter theme. And so the community came together, people were dressed up. The town was packed. It was really a whole lot of fun to see everybody out and about and going to the different shops and getting food and things like that. The left top picture there shows the table that we set up. And, we had games and things that people could take away, and people could ask questions. And so it was an interesting event. It was one way that it didn't you didn't have to do a whole lot of stuff because the event was already happening. You already had a group of people there. So it was one way, from a sort of a economic event, I guess, that's already happening. We just had a table, for instance. You don't have to go that far, but still had to get to be part of something that was fun and had a lot of people involved. So we did do some of the more traditional boring stuff as well. And we presented a few times to Grafton City Council and to the Taylor County Commission. We were happy to have those opportunities to speak to folks. The benefit of doing things like that is, one, you're sort of on a public record, so you kind of get that information out there. You have the potential to get support from folks that are decision makers or that can, that can do things. They can get a sense of what your projects, what's going on, what are the projects that you're looking at. So again, those aren't the most exciting things, but I think it's important to keep those sorts of things in mind because it's, again, sort of low input, basically, and that, you don't have to do a whole lot of work to get that done. But, you can end up in the paper as well sometimes if those things get reported on. So some of that, being able to balance the fun stuff and the more creative stuff is good too. But sometimes, if you have a little bit of time, sort of doing those more boring presentations are not a terrible idea as well, just to sort of keep that public engagement ongoing throughout a project. And then another thing that we did not do surveys in this case, but another type of public engagement I think can be reporting and creating plans for folks that are getting out into the community, and it gives an opportunity for people to provide feedback or read about a project and understand sort of the next steps. So we created the report called Growing Tourism in Grafton and Taylor County, a report that was a market analysis and looking at redevelopment potential in Grafton. And we shared that report. So again, that's not maybe a typical forward-facing community engagement, but it was a way for us to provide feedback and potentially get additional feedback from folks in the community as well. So I think that was all that I'm going to go through. I'm going to pass over to Heather and Taylor, and they are going to talk about a really fun event that they created to bring the community in to their project.
All right. Thank you, Kendra. I'm going to go first, and I want to apologize in advance. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so if I have to mute myself for a coughing fit, I'll be right back. But I am happy to be with you all today, despite my little cold. So we are, for this portion of the presentation, we're staying right in Grafton. And actually, I'm so happy that Kendra mentioned the market study that they did as part of the assessment grant, because I think that demonstrates, that's a really kind of tangible demonstration point for how one set of community engagement and work can build and like allow you to build to the next level of community engagement and work. So I am the executive director of the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation. We are West Virginia's statewide land bank. And the role that we have been playing in Grafton is to sort of come alongside of folks like Heather with Unleash Tiger and really help to zero in on a brownfield redevelopment project, like a specific property, right? And so the project that we're working on together now, which was identified as part of this community engagement that Kendra was talking about, is the redevelopment of the former Hazel Atlas glass plant. It's about, I don't know, a little bit, right around 2.5 acres, right along the Tigert River. It is in the Fetterman neighborhood of Grafton. So it is right next to some railway tracks and then right next to a residential area, as well as the public park and pool is kind of right across the railway tracks from where this property is. And so for those of you that are familiar with the Brownfield cleanup grant process, you will know that there's a significant portion of community engagement that's required for grant recipients throughout the lifetime of the grant, because EPA really does want to make sure that you're sort of like continuing to engage the community all along. So, and I think this is a really good example of kind of like, so through the community engagement in the previous assessment grant, that Kendra was talking about, we heard that Hazel Atlas was a site of real interest for the community, right? This was a place that people wanted to see addressed. And so that kind of spurred more activity on our part in seeing, hey, is this a place that we could work on getting a cleanup grant for? And then when we do, when we are looking at that cleanup grant, are the plans that we are suggesting, are the redevelopment plans that we're suggesting as part of our cleanup grant, are those plans in line with what the community wants and needs, right? And so as a part of this grant application process and kind of like laying out how we were going to do the work of the grant, we came up with a community engagement strategy that was really started with a very specific event that Heather and I sort of put on together. And I think, Heather really spearheaded that event, and we'll talk through exactly what we did and why we made the choices that we made here in just a second. But I did want to talk about like, when we're thinking about community engagement is only useful, it's only successful if we're actually engaging the community. right? And so what we had found, we were awarded the grant this year, but this wasn't the first year that we applied for the grant. So we had applied in a previous grant cycle. And in that previous grant cycle, we were kind of rushing to catch up, right? We had a really tight turnaround time for that grant. And so we did sort of piggyback on a lot of events that were already happening, city council meetings, First Friday events, those kinds of things. And what that meant was we ended, or what, I don't know if that's the wrong way to phrase that. What we noticed as a result of sort of planning that way was that very few people came. There was not a lot of community engagement. We got the folks that did come were very engaged in the conversations, but we only got, I think, 10 or 12 people to provide feedback on the project and on the grant and on our community engagement strategy. And so Heather and I were really sort of, like here we're saying like, it's important to notice like what are the actual requirements. You got to post in the newspaper. It's got to be a legal notice that is put out a certain number of days in advance of the meeting, all of that, right? And we met the requirements exactly the way that we were supposed to for this grant. And still, even though we had met all of the requirements for the grant, we weren't seeing a lot of turnout. And the folks that we were seeing turning out to this sort of thing were not residents of the Fetterman neighborhood. So they weren't people who were going to be directly impacted by the redevelopment of the site. And so this was kind of a challenge that we were thinking through, Heather and I are just putting our heads together. Okay, how do we solve this problem of we're not hearing from the folks that are going to be directly impacted? Community engagement is only useful if those are the folks we're hearing from, right? That's the community that we need to be engaging. And if we're not able to engage, if we have not yet been able to engage that community in some of the previous strategies that we've used, what's a different strategy? Can we think outside of the box here to try to get us to a strategy that might be more useful in engaging the folks that we are actually trying to engage on this particular project? So I'm gonna stop talking. I think that's enough of a frame. Like why? So the story is that Heather and I are then putting our heads together, and I'll toss it to Heather. She can tell you more about sort of what we came up with.
Thank you, Taylor. So thank you all for being here today. To Taylor's point, my name's Heather Hudson, and I'm the executive director of Unleashed Tigert. We're a small nonprofit located in Grafton, West Virginia, which is a small community. Our whole county has like 17,000 people in it, and our city has less than 5. So we are talking small town Appalachia with a whole lot of opportunity and challenge in front of it, probably like many of the areas that you guys live and work in. So just to continue with where Taylor led off, our biggest issue was people not showing up to what we were already doing, and then that targeting requirement. So Taylor talked about, this, we had to get into this residential area. We're in downtown rural Appalachia town along the river and the railroad. We're talking a community of 20 to 25 houses, right? That we had to specifically target. How do we get those people to show up? Well, if you don't mind to go to the next slide, we got to say in our EPA grant that we put on a community block party, which was like the coolest thing ever. So we broke all of the rules of traditional community engagement that you would have here. And to Taylor's point, we put out the public notice, we did all the things, but we hit social media and we hit it hard. So our biggest thing was we did it outside of traditional hours. We did this on a Sunday afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. in the park that was right in the middle of the houses that we were trying to get to with this program. So we started with the kids. And so Taylor and I are both parents. So we thought, how can we get the parents to come out on a Sunday afternoon? So we rented bounce houses and we put them out where you could see them from the main thoroughfares that come through. We also got a DJ and we had him put his speakers blasting toward those houses and that main thoroughfare. So people, whenever they came by, they saw and what's going on down there. So we put out flyers, we had it in the newspaper, we hit social media hard leading up to it. But then throughout the day while we were there, Taylor and I actually jumped onto Facebook Live multiple times throughout the day. So we had communication, not just with the people who were on site, but also people who maybe couldn't come that day, and they could chat with us live. So not only to promote what we were doing at the event, but to get them engaged. We also put out a survey via social media leading up to the event. So that way we could have that on official record, people who couldn't make it but still had an interest in the property that we were in. To Kendra's point about involving your consultants and the things that they can bring into it, Taylor from West Virginia Land Stewardship brought with her the big maps and the big visioning boards that had already been done. So this property that we were working on is something that Taylor or that Kendra and her group had already kind of identified and had worked on. So we had some preliminary plans of what could be done with a redevelopment. So Taylor had those blown up and put on huge boards, and we had pizza and food and all of the things. So we really created an atmosphere for our community to come out and have a free, fun family afternoon. And hey, while you're here, talk to us about this project. And I think we had over 70 people, not counting the kids, that actually showed up and actively engaged with us, signed in at this project and at this program. So it was a lot of fun. And I, as the project sponsor, we flipped the bill for this. Taylor held her part of getting all of the maps and everything printed as the person who currently owns the property under West Virginia Land Stewardship. But the actual cost of the project was a project sponsor cost that we took on. So, go ahead, Taylor.
It was a little bit more expensive. There was a little bit more expense. There was significant more expense than showing up to like a city council meeting, which is, you know, theoretically free apart from the materials that you print to pass out, right? There was more organization. Heather worked really hard to make sure that the pizzas were ordered and the DJ was booked and the bounce houses arrived and were set up correctly, right? But in the end, when the numbers for our survey data collection were at around 70, and for like, you know, number of conversations that we had that day were, you know, between 50 and 70 for folks that actually like showed up and talked to us and left feedback either, you know, verbally or in writing at the event. When you compare that impact to like the 12 people that we were talking to before, I feel like it, you know, being really highly visible in the neighborhood, being loud, taking up space and being fun, really did solve the participation issue that was kind of getting in the way in terms of our community engagement in the past.
Yeah.
One more thing that I don't want to miss is that Sandra talked a little bit up front about sort of facing myths or kind of like rumors or misinformation head on. And I think that because we were in this kind of neutral space, we're in the park that's near everybody's house and we're hanging out in a pavilion and we're all eating pizza and listening to the kids giggle while they jump on the bouncy house. Like that gave us a chance to have some very genuine conversations with people in the community where some folks were saying, you know, I don't think this is a good idea, or, you know, I think you should do this. And what they're suggesting is maybe not an idea that we've heard shared by everyone, or not really feasible given the constraints of the site. And I can let Heather talk a little bit more about this. I just thought that it was a great venue to be having those kinds of conversations in.
Absolutely. So just to build on that point, in a traditional public meeting, people can say something out loud and then you can kind of get ganged up on of like, yeah, why this, why that? We don't believe in this. In this method and in this format, it was really low key, really casual, one-on-one conversations. So people didn't come in hot and heavy and ready to fight. They came in just ready to have conversations. And we did. People feel really passionately about this one piece of property in Grafton. So we did have people who said, you know, this isn't what I would want to see done, or I want to see this stay an industrial site and create jobs. So then we just had really open conversation about where that would land, and a lot of questions that we didn't have the answers to that we were able to say, cool, let us get back to you. And they gave us their information. So we were able to do that. So that worked really well. As to the questions in the chat about paying for it, so let me address those. Unleash Tigert is a development nonprofit. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit, but we have a focus on downtown development in the city and area within we work. So it made sense for us as a nonprofit to make an investment into this type of event to be able to achieve our grant. So in this arrangement, Taylor with West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation actually owns the property. She's the one who actually got the grant. She did write in there some ongoing costs for community engagement and updates once the grant period starts. But Unleash Tigert, as the nonprofit who will own this property after it's cleaned up, decided that it was worth it for us to make that type of investment. In all, it was like $700 that we put into this event. And I would do it over and over and over again on every project that I have the opportunity to. We have 6 brownfields that we're working on right now, and I would repeat this project and this block party as many times as I can. Does that answer the questions about the funds?
Yeah, and I just maybe to clarify again a little further that, you know, I was speaking about working on the assessment grant that we worked in Grafton, which did include the Hazel Atlas property. And this community engagement, the block party that they had, was very specifically for the cleanup application. So just to further clarify.
And I think too, we always knew that we were going to be able to solve the problem of who was going to fund this. It would have been fairly simple for Heather's organization or for land stewardship to foot the bill for this kind of an event, going after the, you know, to make it possible to go after the cleanup grant. So I think that like that too was one of the things that made this successful, is because we had, first of all, really great information and foundation to build on from the assessment, all of the work that had been done during the assessment grant. And so then when the assessment grant wrapped up and it was time for us to say, okay, we're going to go after this cleanup grant, we had a little gap, right? Between, you know, there's been a little gap between the funding that was available through the assessment grant and the funding that is now available now that we've received the cleanup grant. But we filled that gap both through, you know, land stewardship kind of and Unleash, saying it's worth our staff time. You know, it's worth our staff time to do this. It's worth a little bit of investment in terms of this event. It's worth these kinds of incidental costs, or like the cost of placing the legal ad or those types of things, right? And I think that, you know, one of the things that makes this type of community engagement incredibly successful is that, so land stewardship is a statewide organization. We work all across West Virginia. And while like I personally have done some work in Grafton in the past, I don't live there. Our organization isn't based in Grafton. And so being able to follow Heather's lead, as, you know, somebody who's based in Grafton with an organization that has a specific focus on redevelopment in Grafton, I think that really did make all of the difference in terms of being able to do community engagement in a way that was really connected to and responsive to the community.
Sure. And Taylor, I don't know the answer to this question since you wrote the grant, but there's a question about it, how was that listed on the grant budget? Did you do it as in kind or match? Do you know?
I don't remember. I'd have to get back to you. Carrie, do you know off the top of your head how we would list that?
I'd like to pull back and I can answer that question sort of when I want to talk about the participant support cost and eligibility in the context of an EPA grant, which I put some stuff in the chat about. So I think we're moving into questions. Or are we do we need to do some other stuff? But we can yeah. So Thank you for clarifying that nuance about what was the assessment grant, what was prepping for the cleanup grant. I just wanted to clarify that since 2020, in the cycles since 2020 for EPA grants, they added eligible costs for what they call participant support costs. And I put some links in the chat up to take you to the guidance directly from the EPA Brownfield program about what that means to them. And there's some frequently asked questions in last year's guidelines, excuse me, in that second link that tell you a little bit more. I have not heard anything about changes to participant support costs in the next cycle, which, as I said at the beginning, is expected to open at any moment. But it is a year when we don't know what all the changes might be because of an administrative change, or a change in administration. And so I just don't know. But assuming that they look the same, they do allow you to help do things that encourage people to participate in your project, that encourage ways for people to engage. So things like paying for childcare or having a stipend for a liaison and things like that. So you can learn more about that, and I'm always happy to talk through it. If you have an existing EPA grant, you could potentially use some of that for these participant support costs. If it's already in your budget, you should be fine. If it's not, there are opportunities to make changes to your work plan. You should just talk it out with your project officer, and I'm also happy to talk it out with you either separate from your project officer or alongside you with your project officer to sort of like be creative about what works to make sure that you can do it in an effective way, but also follow all of the right guidelines and guidance to do it. That's a pretty new thing for EPA, right? In the scheme of Brownfield's life, from 2002 to now, it's not been around very long. So I don't know that they've seen it used a whole lot, and I don't know. They may be a little unsure, let's say, about things that haven't happened before, but we can get creative. That doesn't mean they'll say no. All of our project officers, at least in Region 3, are very community engaged and project engaged and want to find ways that things work. And I find them to be in the same lane as everything you've heard today about the importance of community engagement and of really, truly creative community engagement. So that's my long-winded answer to that. I think as far as an EPA grant, if you're writing a new EPA grant, assuming that, let's just make an assumption for the purposes of this conversation that participant support costs would be allowed. You just want to make sure again that you're falling in that they're reasonable, not a huge part of your budget, etc. For EPA grants in the next round, regardless of the type, there will not be a required match. So Taylor didn't have a required match either, so I am confident she didn't call it a match. She may have referred to it as in-kind, or EPA likes the word leveraging. So that would be my recommendation moving forward. Assessment grants will never require match unless they change the statute. So there is no requirement of match on an assessment grant. After this year and this cycle, when they finish spending the rest of the bipartisan infrastructure funding, the cost share requirement for cleanup grants and multi-purpose grants is expected to return. There is legislation that might change the amount, but as of right now, that's set to return. So that's kind of the answer on match. If you need clarification on that, please put it in the chat, or I'm happy to set up a conversation about that specifically. And then I think maybe Kendra, do you want to wrap us up with the tips to remember? And then we've got a couple other good discussion questions in the chat that we can talk about, and then see if any more things come up.
Sure, I can go through these, and I certainly hope Taylor and Heather too, if you have any other sort of tips and tricks from either what you've learned or anything else thinking about. Number one, have food and drinks, have bounce houses, have pizza, have a reason to get people there. I mean, that's just the reality. Bring a DJ, get people excited, have it in a nice cozy coffee shop where people want to go, where they want to be, to parks, that sort of thing. But provide some sort of impetus or bribery really for people to come and join you. Just trying to provide throughout your project, providing a variety of ways that people can participate. Everybody, I love the idea that Taylor and Heather, they had this great big party, which was really awesome right in the neighborhood, but also having that Facebook Live and having the survey trying to get people in different manners, is really great. And just trying to, I guess for all of us thinking about avoiding, what you realistically can do, just make sure when you're thinking through these things, maybe in your budget or time frame, bounce houses and big party doesn't work, but that still doesn't mean you can't have, an interesting opportunity, creating, again, having, maybe there's a First Friday event or something, and you may have something special, extra food or something, or games or something like that. So sort of scaling what you're able to do could still be fun and interesting. And, maybe you don't have to go all the way out, but that's really fun if you can as well. And I think just another point to add is just in generally in community engagement, again, it's an ongoing process, and share the good news when you can. Share your wins, reach out to folks, let people know you're still there, that you're still working. That if you have community engagement, you reach out to these folks, you have the bounce house party, you talk to these people, follow up with them, let them know what's going on in that property, let them know, that you got the cleanup grant, and then what are the next steps. So just continue that community engagement, continue reaching out, and particularly for the good stuff. So Taylor, Heather, want to add anything to that?
What came up for me when you were talking, Kendra, is that it's sort of like getting your kids to eat their vegetables, right? Make something creative so that people come out for a bounce house, and then you trick them into talking about brownfields. And then they'll fall in love with brownfields, and you won't have to trick them anymore. So great. Thank you so much to our panelists. I am going to start us off with a bit of a pretty deep question from my friend John Hale in Virginia. And y'all jump in where you can, and then we still have time for more questions, so folks keep putting them in there. John says, what is the real objective of community engagement? Is it sharing a message? Is it identifying what a community wants, or something else? I am going to start us and then open it to our panelists, but I think it depends. And I think it's a good question to ask at the beginning of whatever it is you're doing. Why are we doing it at this time? Right? So what is our purpose this time? As a community engagement evangelizer, let's say, I would say it's always should be multi-directional. So you're not just giving information out, you're gathering information, getting input, because especially if you're a public entity, you're building something for the public, and so they should have a part of that decision-making process. And then I'll just lastly say, in the context of community engagement or input and notification is what EPA calls it, in that context of EPA, they want to know that you have informed the public of what you are doing, and that you have given them an opportunity to provide input and be a part of decisions and plans for the site, whether that's directly related to the site, like a block party, or in the grant, you'll also answer questions about like past planning opportunities, right? Where people had a chance to contribute to maybe a comprehensive plan discussion, and they identified this priority, and this project will meet that priority. You've still been informed by public input and needs. Kendra, Heather, Taylor, anything else to add?
I think that's right, Carrie. I think it's a lot about exchange of information, right? The other thing that I think that has kind of been, and I'm gonna say a little bit about this and then hope that Heather will jump in and say some more maybe, but I think too, um, it can be a little bit about being an active collaborator in the narrative about the project. So like and I think that that's sort of the cycle of both giving and receiving information. But I think that one of the things that we've seen in Grafton is that sometimes there can be roadblocks to projects when people either receive misinformation, perhaps not from folks on the team, or maybe there maybe is a rumor that is generated, and then there's some negative reaction to that, and then there's some negative reaction to the project, and then it kind of grows. And so I think that like community engagement is an opportunity to do reciprocal information sharing. It's also a great opportunity to kind of plant yourself in the middle of the narrative and say, well, we did do the environmental site assessment on that property. Here's what we did find. yes, this is a little bit scary, or no, it's not as scary as we thought, or you can bring in your consultant, like Kendra said, and have them say, okay, well, typically how we would manage this type of environmental contamination is to do some soil removal or to do some capping, or like help to share with the community information that shapes the narrative about the project so that it can be something that they're getting on board with.
Yes, yes, and yes. I think the only thing that I would add on to that, being in the role of the developer, is that it combats what I like to call the loudest voice syndrome. So we know if we are doing community engagement correctly, that we are not going off the opinions or ideals of one or one group. We are really digging in and pulling from the voices of all. And it's just, especially in these small rural towns where the mayor's granddaddy's granddaddy was the mayor, and it's been passed down through all the generations of one family. There's other opinions, there's other ideas. And until we're able to dig into those, things aren't going to change in our communities. So community engagement gives a voice to all. And I think that's the most powerful piece for me.
Yeah,
Thank
and then
you.
all of those voices get to shine through as the narrative about the project instead of just whoever the loudest voice usually is.
Great. John also asks how community engagement activities and results are best documented. I'm going to start with take lots of pictures, and maybe I don't think that they'll be mad when I say that Heather and Taylor put these slides together and you didn't see any pictures of that bounce house because they were having too much fun and forgot to take photos.
That's
So
correct. We did make that mistake. Don't make the same mistake we did. Assign somebody whose entire job at the event is just to take lots of pictures.
a great idea. I think the other thing is to definitely making sure you get sign-in sheets and contact information if people want to stay engaged so that you can make sure that they're getting information as you're able to put it out and that they know about the next block party or the next community meeting or the next time you need help. And then for EPA requirements, and then I'm going to let them talk about the fun bits. They just want meeting notes, a sign-in sheet, and to know what questions you got and how you responded to those questions. So it's just your sort of typical write it all down perspective. I don't know if anybody has any other things that you've done.
We had kind of a standard survey that we put out before the event, and then we use those same 4 questions as the impetus to our conversations. So even in person, we were able to say, like, these were the opinions, and then we were kind of able to aggregate that information and pull that out into the grant application to say, like, these are the really specific things that came back on a repetitive basis. So you can still document those one-on-one personal conversations.
And then there's just like dumb little stuff that you can do. Put the pizza behind the sign-in sheet. Have somebody stand next to the sign-in sheet and say, "Oh my God, there's free pizza. I'll just have you sign in here." Right? And then everyone who's getting pizza, because that's what everyone's here for, has signed in, right? And you can have like a opt-in checkbox for do you want to get our newsletter about this project or whatever, right? Like you don't have to force people to continue engaging with you if they really don't want to. But even just like where you put different aspects of the event, or like where you set up your sign-in sheet, or how you present that to people, we got everyone who came into the park that day, I think, was on our sign-in sheet, whether they had come to play on the playground or the bounce house or to be part of the event, or just because they wanted to go to the park that day. We did get everyone signed in on that sign-in sheet. And so like just little stuff like that you can do too to sort of boost your participation and kind of build your because I really think like this is a thing that my public relations guru mom taught me. Actually, my mom taught me this. Your list is your life. So if you can, the more people that you can get on the list, the more people you can engage in the future too.
Yep. And don't forget the power of social media, putting out there that you're doing things and a recap of the event. if you do that like on a community page, people are going to respond, and you can ask like, can we use these comments? So we did a lot of social media pooling for our grant application too, because really great information came from people who connected via social media that weren't there in person.
Well, and it is quite compelling when your Facebook Live is like, look at all the fun these children are having jumping in the bounce house. Don't you want to come? And then all of the kids are bothering their parents. I want to go to the bounce house. And so we were getting we were using social media to boost participation even while the event was occurring.
I'm gonna model one of the things that Heather just said and ask Haley to launch our survey. Feel like that? We have just a couple of quick poll questions that really help us when we're reporting to EPA and also help us build our sessions to make them useful for you. So we do have time for any quick wrap-up thoughts from our panelists. I will just say that Mid-Atlantic Tab is here to help you with all of these things. And so we are happy to come help facilitate a meeting, to brainstorm about a meeting, to be that third party that Kendra talked about if you don't have a QEP yet, that can come and talk about the technical aspects or the nitty gritty of EPA programs that we eat, sleep, and breathe over here, but you probably don't. And on our last slide is, I'm asking Haley to do way too many things at once, but on our last slide is our contact information, which you'll also get in the email that she sends as a follow-up tomorrow. But we're, as I said, always happy to come out. It's much more enjoyable for us to do this with you in the community than to sit in our desk. So give us a shout, and thanks so much for coming.